When I saw Kendra hug Lauryn after she got exposed, I wanted to beat the living hell, the literal hell out of her, because that's exactly where that stuff was coming from. It was coming straight from the pit of hell. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I was screaming at the TV and I was coming undone. By the way, I'm Trey Tucker. I'm a mental health therapist, and this is Rugged. So we're making your 20s and 30s legendary, but today we're doing our series on Unknown Number, what Netflix didn't show you. And today we're talking about Lauryn. I've already done a video on Kendra. We're going to talk about all things Lauryn and all the things that happened to her and the effects that happened inside of her. We're going to start with that scene where she's hugging Lauryn, but we're also going to get into other things like, is Lauryn potentially also mentally ill? Can the victim of someone else's crime, someone else's mental illness, can they also be mentally ill even before the crime even happened to them? We'll also talk about, why did she want to be around her mom after her mom got exposed? For a while, at least, she was still wanting her mom's presence and her mom's comfort. We'll talk about why that is. And it is normal at first, but we'll follow that trail as we go, because the documentary showed some clues that at least she started to come around where she was thinking differently about her mom at the very end. So when I watched the documentary the first time through, at the end, I realized there were so many clues that I missed. Even as a therapist who's trained to be reading body language, there were a lot of clues that I missed. So I went back and watched it again and took really detailed notes. And one of the biggest clues that I kept on, I saw it, but I didn't really connect it until the end, was how flat Lauryn's facial expressions were and some of the things they talked about with her friends, or really the lack of friends. So I'm going to go through some of the clues that I might have noticed, but really did miss about Lauryn along the way, because you can look back and see there were little breadcrumbs showing you things that, okay, these were clues that we could have caught. So let's talk about Lauryn's body language when Kendra was hugging on her and everything was coming out into the open. I was in shock when I was seeing it, and it was clear that she was in shock. Lauryn herself was totally disconnected from the moment. Her eyes were wide. She was staring straight ahead, a little bit down. She was receiving the hug. She wasn't pushing her mom away, which I would have thought that she would have shoved her mom as far as she could and wanted to run away and scream. But instead, I think she just shut down. And as she was receiving that hug, it was almost like she was trying to comfort her mom, and it was clear that her mom was trying to use her as comfort. There was no attempt on Kendra's part to actually help Lauryn in that moment. It was all Kendra just taking from Lauryn, basically probably how she did her whole life, because Kendra thought Lauryn was essentially her salvation, the thing that was going to fix her. And as Kendra was getting exposed, Lauryn once again became that tool for Kendra's own use and that fuel for her own benefit. And poor thing, I mean, she was truly, she couldn't talk, she couldn't speak. But the one time her emotions really broke, she started crying when Sean told Kendra that the marriage is over, that I can't do this anymore. That's the moment when the tears started flowing for Lauryn. So it takes a long time for our brains to catch up to some horrific news. I mean, a lot of people, we do go into that freeze mode. You've heard of fight, flight, or freeze before. Most of us are going to freeze when it's news that's that overwhelming. There are a few other examples of people who actually fly into action, whether it's toward a certain threat or away from it. But most of us, we freeze. All right, let's talk about her body language throughout the interviews from start to finish. The one thing I noticed early on is that she didn't smile much. Her eyes didn't really give any sort of emotions. Her eyebrows stayed the same. They never raised. They never came down. She just kind of seemed flat, almost emotionless. There were a couple little times toward the end where she would show some tears as she was talking about her mom, but for the most part, it was almost like matter of fact, almost like it didn't happen to her, or like she was separating herself from it or dissociating from it. So I don't know if that's a result of the trauma, or that may just be kind of how she is. Some of our personalities are more flat in nature, but here's my theory. If Kendra was enmeshing her from a really young age, if Kendra thought, this is my salvation, you're the thing that's going to fix me, then somebody like that isn't going to allow their child to have an identity of their own. They're not going to allow them to have a personality of their own. So it would make a lot of sense that Lauryn may not have much emotion. In fact, her friends even said she never really showed emotion. She never really talked about things that are important to her. She just kind of talked about sports, and she played her sports, and that was it. The sense was like nobody really knew her, maybe other than Owen. And it makes sense to me that a mother who really is trying to take from her daughter isn't going to allow that daughter to have her own separate, independent identity. Another angle on this is, could her flat affect be a survival mechanism or a defense mechanism? Because here's how this works. When something horrific happens to us, we may never grieve it. We may never fully accept it. And if that happens, our brain just shoves it into our subconscious. Like if you've ever seen the Inside Out movies, they take those memories and the little ball and they send them up the tube and out into like Neverland. That's a lot of times what happens is our brain knows that that memory is so painful that we can't process it. And if we tried to process it, it would send us into overwhelm and shutdown mode. So our brain, in a way of trying to protect us from the pain, can a lot of times just stuff the memory, but that also can cause us to basically stuff almost every emotion in general. Because if pain is so wrapped up and unprocessed, then even other emotions to our subconscious seem like danger. Because if we let any emotions happen, then this pain that we're trying to keep corralled might explode. So I can see that flat affect potentially being a defense mechanism just so no other pain happens. Because if the thinking is, well, if we just stay flat and not let anything affect us, then we won't have to acknowledge the pain that happened to us. And that takes me back to that moment when her mom was getting exposed and she allowed her to hug her. I wonder if she had really learned how to manage emotions and really how to feel emotions in the first place, much less manage them. But if she knew that, she had that skill, and if she really had a sense of herself, a strong sense of who she was as an independent young woman, would she have allowed that hug? Or would she have had the confidence and the inner strength to push this perpetrator away, push the pain away, the person that was causing that pain? Again, I'm just guessing here because I don't know these people, but I can't imagine that somebody who really has a strong sense of self is going to allow someone who hurt them so long in so many different ways to then hug them when all the truth is coming out. And that also makes me wonder, what is Lauryn's relationship to love in general now? Because the massive betrayal by her mom, the father, I don't know exactly what's going on with Sean. I'm going to do a separate episode on him. But even at the end of the documentary, when the two of them were hugging and Sean was telling him how much she loved her, that hug looked forced. That hug, there was coldness there. Their bodies weren't actually really coming together. It was just like one of those awkward hugs that you see guys sometimes do. It was like, yeah, we're hugging, but we're not bringing it in. Something seemed off there. So I don't know. I hope Lauryn has the capacity to receive love and then therefore give the love as well. But she may have had so much damage done to her that it may take years of therapy. And you look at Owen. Owen's mad at her now too. And I don't know the full story of everything that's happened since the incident and since the documentary. But as far as I know, Lauryn didn't do anything directly to Owen. But Owen says, I'm not talking to her ever again. And so if that's her only real relationship from a romantic sense, and that blew up through no fault of her own, then I could see her nervous system and her subconscious saying, you know what? Love's not for us. We're just going to exist. We're going to keep emotions away. We're going to do our thing, whether it's sports or a job, and we're just going to go through the motions of life day to day. I sure hope that's not how she ends up, but if you leave stuff like that untreated, that's usually the destination. And on the topic of healing our stuff, the documentary made no mention of any sort of therapeutic follow-up with any of these people involved. So no mention of whether Lauryn went to therapy or Owen or Jill or Sean, and certainly not Kendra. Kendra obviously was making the excuse in court of how, I have a mental illness and I was in crisis for 10 years. And it's a whole nother subject. I think she was just trying to get pity in that moment. But if the documentary is going to at least allow those quotes in their show, I wish they would also follow up and say, okay, here's the story after the story. All these people engaged in therapy. You don't have to tell us what type of therapy or anything, any details about it, but at least if you're going to tell the story of the pain, also tell us the story of the recovery and the healing, because that's what makes us grow as people. That's what really helps us step into who we fully are, because we're never going to get out of this life without pain and without discomfort. So let's normalize the whole process and show, yes, you're going to go through tough stuff, and here's how to get through it. So from a mental health perspective, I wish they would have normalized the actual work, the therapy work of healing what happens to us, because we can't control what happens to us, but it is our responsibility to then do something about that. All right, so to me, one of the most confusing and baffling parts, both for me and everybody else I've talked to and a lot of the media response, is Lauryn, at least early on, after the exposure of everything, she kept talking about, yeah, I still want my mom. I feel like I'm not myself. I feel like I've lost a part of me. And on the surface, that just sounds just bizarre. Like it's total denial of what happened. And that's exactly what it is. It's normal for a child, or really for anybody who has been betrayed by someone that they have such a long history of trust and love with, or at least in her case, she thought was love. So it's not realistic to expect somebody just to immediately flip a switch and say, all right, now I know I want nothing to do with you from the very moment of exposure. The brain can't catch up to events like that. That's the whole reason we call it a grief process, is just because grief is, all right, here's reality, and then here's where your brain is, and your brain just can't fast forward to reality. It's just too complex of a machine to get all the stuff out of its system and just say, okay, we accept reality. Because the end of grief is acceptance. And the grief process is the brain catching up to that reality. And so Lauryn, it does make sense as I stepped back and thought about it from that psychological perspective, is that, yeah, she would want her mom, at least initially, because with the enmeshment, a mom or a parent who's enmeshing with their child, they're going to make that child feel like that you need me as a parent to even breathe. I am the main part of who you are. I am like an essential body part. So if I all of a sudden get my arm taken away, then of course I'm going to miss my arm. I'm going to be in shock for a little bit. Like, I want my arm back. When she loses her mom, it's like losing that body part, or really like losing the sense of life. The source of life is that she thought my mom is like everything. She's my oxygen. So it's unrealistic to think she's just going to immediately go into resenting and hating her mom right off the bat. But we'll go into some of those stages that Lauryn showed actually in the interview of how you kind of see her turn and go through that process of, I want my mom, and maybe now I don't. So when we look at Lauryn's process from the start of the documentary, and especially from the point where everything got exposed, she does really show a lot of the stages of grief. So first, it's shock. We've already covered that. And she even speaks to that. Like, toward the end, she's trying to process everything in the interview, and she's like, I still don't know. Did my mom really do that? Like, it doesn't even seem real that this actually happened. That's all part of the shock and the grief process. The next one is sadness, and that's a huge part of the grief process. We have to allow that sadness to come through us, to come out, whether it's in the form of tears or other physical manifestations. But in this case, the tears first came out when everything was getting exposed, and she heard her dad saying that the marriage was over. And I think she cried maybe one other time when she was actually being interviewed, but the tears came later, and that's usually how it works. And if somebody's really connected to their body and they've done a lot of work on themselves and they know themselves well, they can allow some of those emotions to come through quicker and process through quicker. And that's definitely the healthier way. But most of us just aren't that skilled at it. So she shows that moving from shock to sadness. And then anger is a huge part of the grief process. And of course, we don't get to see any sort of physical or verbal anger from her, but she finally comes around and says, I'm not ready to see my mom yet. And this is like toward the very end of the whole documentary. And so I guess some time must have passed. But in order to get to that point where you say, I'm not ready to see somebody or do something related to recovery, a lot of the reasons that somebody's not ready yet is there's still anger. And that also means there's still pain going on in there. So I was proud of her for at least acknowledging, you know what? Yeah, I'm not ready. And maybe, I don't know what Netflix cut out of the interviews, so I'm just going on what they left in. But it could be that they left out something. Maybe she takes a guess about what she's afraid she would do to her mom or say to her mom just out of anger if she actually met with her. So if she's done that kind of work by this point, good for her for moving past it. And then part of grief is also confusion, because so often you just never get an answer as to why. Why did this happen? Why did they do this? And even Jill said in the court, like, was it worth it? You're never going to get a satisfactory answer to that, especially if you're dealing with somebody who's a possible psychopath or a possible narcissist. Like, the confusion is always going to be there, and you'll drive yourself crazy trying to make sense of it because there is no real sense to be made of it. So Lauryn still acknowledges, like, there's no answer. She doesn't even acknowledge the possible explanations. Was she enmeshing me? Was she attracted to Owen? all these other potential motives. Lauryn doesn't say those things out loud. I don't know if she's actually considering them in her head, but the confusion is always going to be there at some degree, even when you've moved fully through the grief process. And the grief process, it's not just about what happens to us. It's about the people we lose because of what happens to us. And in this case, it's about losing your mom. Not just Lauryn losing her specific mom, but anybody whose parent or friend or boyfriend betrays you in any way. You got to grieve the pain that was inflicted on you, and you got to grieve the loss of that person and that symbol that they are in your life. And I can't imagine having to grieve the loss of a mom when I'm that young and when the mom is still alive. Like, I lost my mom to cancer, and that was painful enough. And I was an adult at that point. The pain of that, I still don't have words for. But trying to put myself into Lauryn's shoes or anybody else in that age or who has experienced that level of abuse, there's no way I can empathize. But I do know that has to be grieved, because whenever we lose something, grief always happens when we lose something major, when something major changes, or when someone dies. And we always think grief only happens when someone dies, but no, it's any major life change or any major loss. So in this case, she's probably for the rest of her life going to be in some level of grief over the pain, but also losing her mom, or at least the reality that she thought her mom was, because she thought her mom was an anchor, and in a lot of ways she was, but that anchor was also destructive. And so coming to grips with that can take a lot of work and a long time. All right, now let's shift over to the police. Another thing that had me enraged and ready to strangle somebody was how they did not take care of Lauryn in that moment when they were confronting Kendra. I mean, the fact that they brought Lauryn in to have this conversation at all, like, just separate Lauryn, get her away from the house altogether. Don't make her sit there and hear this stuff. And especially if you're going to bring her in, at least wait until her dad's home. It was just a total botch. And I get it. Like, police aren't trained in this kind of stuff. They should be. There's enough crime related to mental health where they should be trained. And I love police officers. And this is underscoring the fact that they need more training. But this goes beyond the fact of training. This is common sense. Anybody with half a brain or half a heart should realize in the moment, why are we going to bring this poor teenage girl in here to face this evil mother and hear all these accusations with no support around her? Why are you going to bring her in the first place? And why aren't you going to wait at least for some support to be around her? And when they were explaining to Lauryn what her mom had done, they were incredibly vague. I mean, I knew what they were trying to say, and they were just making excuses for her and say, your mom got wrapped up in some stuff, and sometimes we do things we don't mean to do. I'm like, just tell her the truth. Quit trying to infantilize her and make her think that she had no clue what was happening. And the kicker was, Kendra had already started hugging her before the truth had actually sunk into Lauryn, before the cops were actually giving her a clear explanation of what Kendra had done. So at that point, Lauryn, I'm sure, felt trapped, along with the shock she was feeling, because the police weren't giving her a straight explanation. Her dad wasn't there. She was already in confusion and shock, and her mom's hugging all over her. I'm sure it was just too much to process altogether. So I wish the police would have thought this through before they came in there. Another thing is, they knew, Netflix didn't show this, but they knew probably weeks before that all these calls were coming from inside the house. They had traced the IP address to somewhere inside the house. They weren't sure exactly until they showed up at the house. They weren't sure it was Kendra's until then, but they had already told Sean and Kendra and Lauryn that the texts, were coming from inside the house. But why it took them so long to actually come in and confront Kendra, and why they didn't take Kendra away in the moment, and also why did they leave it to Sean to do something with Kendra? It baffles me why they knew so much, but they were so slow to act in the first place. All right, so now let's zoom out and see what can we learn, if anything, from such a horrific story. Because if we can ever take some information and try to avoid somebody else's mistakes, we should do it. So the first thing is, the people in the town, they need to apologize to Lauryn and to Owen both, because they put all kinds of unnecessary pressure on them when they were dating them, calling them the golden couple, and like, oh yeah, y'all are going to stay together forever. And what were they, 13 when they started dating? I personally don't think you should even be dating in middle school. And I'm wondering myself if people should be dating in high school at all, because everybody's growing up so slow these days and everybody's staying so immature. I don't see an upside into dating that young in the first place, but especially people in this town, I think they're living vicariously through this couple, through Owen and Lauryn, because I know how many terrible marriages there are right now. I mean, the divorce stats are incredibly high, but even the people that stay married, the unhappy marriages that stay together, I have a feeling that a lot of these people looked at their own marriage and thought, well, I don't want this marriage anymore. I'm going to live vicariously through this Cinderella couple. And you're putting all kinds of expectations and pressure on this couple, and they're just trying to figure out life. So if we could just take a little pause in the whole dating world and just let people get to know each other and not put labels on it, and just let's see if there's a friendship there at all. And then if something progresses, once we actually become our own independent self and get a sense of our own identity, then maybe we can actually start dating and potentially put expectations on things. And just from a friendship or a dating perspective, we have got to figure out who we are before we start trying to date somebody or really allow somebody really close to us and get to that point where I can't breathe without them. I don't know who I am without them. All the love songs in Hollywood, they're telling us this lie of like, you complete me, I'm nothing without you. That is not just toxic, that's dangerous. So let's zoom out and start figuring out like, okay, who am I? What is my purpose? What gives me value? Because the tendency is you're going to look to your boyfriend or your girlfriend or your spouse, and you're going to look to them to make you feel like you're a somebody, that you have a value, that you have worth. And that might work for a little while, and that's why a lot of marriages stay together for a little while. But then when those chemicals wear off, when those infatuation, feel-good chemicals about that person wear off, the hole gets exposed because the hole never got filled. It just got covered up. That person temporarily made you feel a certain way, and you felt like, okay, I'm fixed, I'm complete. Please avoid that trap, because it's the reason that so many marriages are breaking up and so much toxic dating is happening. And even in friendships, we can have codependent friendships where you're relying too much on somebody else. Now, I don't want you to be totally independent where you don't need anybody, but the goal is interdependence. And that starts with you. You got to figure out, again, who am I? What is my value? What is my purpose? All right, I did a whole separate episode on Kendra, and I would love to have brought back in some of those details into this situation that affected Lauryn even more, but I don't want to repeat myself. So just go back and watch that episode on Kendra, and I'll have more to come about Owen, about Sean, maybe even about the police and other factors in this whole case. Thank you for being with me today. Let's keep moving forward together.